Hello, and welcome to the Two Bald Brothers and a Microphone podcast. This is your host, Danny Ryan. I'm here with another bald man, but it's not my brother. It is Pete Skelly. How are you doing, Pete Skelly?
Yeah, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. I've got a couple of things to talk about. The first thing we'd like to talk about is some recent work that you did with Microsoft. And give me a little bit of background on what you did here.
So, sort of the background is one of the things you and I have been working on, and I know you've done probably at least one, if not more, podcast episodes on sort of our internal transformation to modern SharePoint and Teams and those types of things. Part of what I was doing on sort of the opposite side is doing some internal automation, looking into things like Flow and Microsoft Graph and automatically provisioning Teams and Planner, OneNote, and associated things that go along with an Office 365 group. And the sort of short story is was trying to do some things in Flow, calling Microsoft Graph, and the endpoint that I was actually calling, I could not get to work.
Okay.
And so I actually reached out to a couple of folks, Jeremy Thake, who is a senior program manager on the Microsoft Graph team, and someone that I know from the community, John Liu, who's based in Australia, and tweeted out to them and said, hey, I've been trying to kind of add a team to a group via the Graph, and it's not working, and was wondering if anybody knew what the issue was. Turns out that Thursday, and I was doing this, I think the following Monday, turns out John was actually on the Microsoft Graph community call explaining exactly how to solve my problem the week previous. And although part of my job is to stay up on some of those things, I missed that call. So I actually had to kind of backtrack and use John's solution that he described in that community call, and it worked perfectly. And I tweeted that back out to Jeremy and John, and several other folks commented around it. And Jeremy said, great. Would you and John like to document that process for sort of a lab for the Microsoft Graph community content? And so that's sort of how it started.
Very nice. And so you were was this through like the PNP process, or what did this have to do with that, or what did this have to, or is this him just solving the problem for the community?
This is sort of an alternate route to using PNP. You can kind of layer in some PNP calls and use some of the PNP processes. But I think from our perspective, at least internally and for some of our clients, you a lot of times get into a hybrid situation where you might use Flow to kick off a process because you're using a SharePoint list to actually manage the process. And for me in particular, my scenario was not using the PNP to accomplish creating the group and adding a team to that group, then creating default channels and creating OneNote and kind of all the associated things that go along with our internal processes. So I wasn't doing the PNP stuff, but this is more just Microsoft base Microsoft Graph connectivity. And sort of the twist on what I was doing was I wanted to batch up several of these commands. So I was actually looking into using the Microsoft batch endpoint. And the batch endpoint is pretty powerful between sort of the lab that we did and John Liu's post. The batch endpoint, it really provides you a really great way of making several calls, a batch, to Graph endpoints and being able to sequence those so you can have dependencies of calls. So if you want to create a group and then you want to create a team, add a channel, and you want those to occur sequentially, you can do that. So what I was doing was essentially setting up, creating a team, creating an Office 365 group that I then want to create a team from, provision team resources including channels and apps and tabs. I want to configure the SharePoint site behind the scenes. I also want to configure a OneNote and some OneNote sections and OneNotes, actually, pre-filling basically a structure for what someone might request.
Okay.
And so the process, the lab that we did goes through that. It basically starts from scratch and builds up an Azure AD application, helps you create a custom connector in Flow that actually lets you. The reason I had to do this was at the time, the graph did not support making app only, basically operating as an application, not as a person. It didn't support app only permissions. It supported delegated permissions only. And that use of a custom connector let me kind of overcome the hurdle of not having those app only permissions. And then using the batch calls let me kind of do some advanced work to actually say, don't sequentially go through everything and have this massive flow. I could actually make several calls at once and create several pieces of the pie, so to speak, for my scenario. And the lab actually walks you through creating that connector, then testing, how to call the batch, what that batch endpoint actually means, and then walks you through creating a flow and extending that flow to call a batch. Using the batch connector, call into the batch graph endpoint. And at the end, you have a fully functioning flow that can do exactly what I just described. Create a group, create a team, add channels to that team, and then you're off and running. You can basically do pretty much everything you want from the graph.
And so this is, I guess we were looking at this as far as trying to automating the provisioning process, and sort of how did we want to set everything up when someone requests a new team, and getting everything, all the initial stuff all set up. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a very internally it was something we wanted to do, but it's a very common request from our clients. So provisioning and governance is a very common request.
Yep.
So the classic canonical example is I want to provision a project site. And I want that project site to be based on a group. So there's a team, and I want, certain channels automatically created. I want a general structure put in place. Well, today, a lot of people want not just a team, so a group behind the scenes, but they also want things that go along with that collaboration experience. So they want Planner, they want OneNote, they want a standard OneNote structure. They want certain things in Teams. They may want apps configured inside of Teams.
Yeah.
So although the lab seems very simple, it sets you up to be able to do some really fantastic, things inside of a flow if you want to do them all in a flow. And if not, you have the ability to say, okay, well, let me kick off a process in Flow and maybe call other flows, or call an Azure function, or call Azure Automation Services to do things like call into PnP and configure a very complex structure in SharePoint, for example. So for us, it was sort of tip of the iceberg, but for our customers, we're starting to see them ask for, well, I want to provision, and I have a governance plan, and I want to implement that governance plan, in a standard way.
Gotcha.
And so this was kind of greasing the skids, so to speak, so we could kind of show some folks this, and also, a lot of times we can't show customer case studies or customer code or the solutions that we actually build. So this kind of lets us show some folks, clients, prospective clients, and even me when I do community events, show folks, here's what's possible.
So can we link off to the lab or to the blog post, or both of those things?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I've got a blog post on my personal blog.
Okay, excellent.
And it's called Creating a Microsoft Graph Custom Batch Connector, and that's the exact same name of the docs, .microsoft.com lab.
Excellent. So we'll link off to that. I think this is plenty of information for if you're interested about that lab or more information on this. We'll provide a link on this blog post, and I really appreciate you doing this, Pete.
Okay, great.
Gotcha. Thanks so much for everybody for listening, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.